Welcome to the Grid Mod Pod, brought to you by AEIC. In this podcast, you'll hear from the utility industry's top operations leaders on how their companies are working to modernize and improve our ever-evolving power grid. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Connor. I'm so happy to have you on the podcast today. How we met and finding a fellow data nerd. Can I call you nerd? Is exciting, but not just, data and data analytics, but what it really takes to start putting the pieces together. I think a lot of us get hung up on talking about the end goal, nirvana, the North Star, but we tend to not take the time to think about the basic building blocks. So I look forward to jumping in and hearing about your journey and what you're up to and kind of talk about how that relates to grid modernization and everything happening in that space. So with that, I'm going to flip it over to you to give an opportunity for our listeners to meet you and kind of hear your background and where you sit today, and we'll go from there.
Well, thank you, Liz. It's great to be on the podcast, and I'm excited for our conversation today. For those listening, my name is Dr. Connor Valentine. I am a partner with RedSynth. We are a consulting firm specializing in helping our clients make data-driven decisions. And that might seem very vague, but something that's unique about us is we start from a clear calculation of return on investment. So we don't take jobs unless we know that we can better, the client's situation. And in the field of data, there's a lot of ways we make that happen.
Yeah. And so, one thing we talk about the Grid Mod Pod is, there's this term, grid modernization, and I love, just to kind of ground the listeners in case this is your first episode, is there's a transformation happening not only in the electric utility industry, but quite frankly, in all things civilization. No, just that's too big, but it's not. Not only is how we use energy, but how it's created, how it's transformed, how it's transmitted, how it's distributed, and then how the customers are demanding it or, realizing what it is. All of those components are changing, but so is our transportation. So is our supply chains, how we accrue and deliver and develop and create our food systems, and then really, I think, the power of how we communicate with each other. And so when you think about the core element in each one of those transformations, it really comes down to data. And we've been talking about data, I think, for the last, 3-4 years at a very alarmed state, because we have seen other industries take this data and drive it to do things that we really couldn't imagine. And so when we're in the grid mod space, it's like, okay, how can we unlock the potential of the existing grid while transforming it to this reality that some of us, predict, but ultimately we all know it's going to a space that we have not probably even determined. But with that is now we have these utilities with an enormous amount of data. And how do we unlock the data itself? So from your experience, how do you see, or what have you seen, kind of break it down for these newbies, IT systems, right? Because we say that, but and the data integration, the mechanics of it, things to think through, things to ask, things to ponder that will support this transformation of the grid. So what do you think? Break those down, and how's that challenge for the utility currently?
Starting with the huge big picture, right? So my background is in chemical engineering, right? And so why am I on this podcast about electricity, right? Well, our group of PhDs are experts in the fields of optimization, mathematical analysis to determine the best decision given a lot of data, right? We're not talking about 10, 20 possible decisions. We're talking about millions of different variables coming in live, right? You're coming in live and you got to make a decision based on your plant, based on your distribution system. Could be logistics, right? We do supply chain analysis. So we're used to looking at the big picture. The starting point of that is the data, right? So I think it's important to recognize that your data is actually your business. That is your understanding of what is going on in space and time, and not the other way around, right? When you're doing these kind of analyses and trying to look forward into the future, maybe you're trying to run a prediction model to understand where the next outage is going to be. Maybe you're trying to understand where placing a new battery could add the most stability, right? If your data doesn't match reality, well, your odds of making a good decision start to just tank. And that's not a good place to be in.
So when you think about like utility, like, so we have IT systems, and I guess I'll just kind of break it down. And I think it's how the grid has evolved over 140 years is, originally we had little microgrids that then, economies of scale realized you can have one generator to serve many, which then turned into like really in the 70s, we started tying all of these individual grids into the massive machine that we have now through the transmission connections, blah, blah, blah. And to run that grid, everyone kind of knew their lane, right? You had your financial sector, you had your regulation, you had your customer engagement, and then you had your operations teams that like were assessing the health, were understanding the reliability based on the performance, you were planning, and it was very siloed. So if you think about the data that exists, it's there. But now when we're pulling on strings that of the distribution that could impact the transmission and vice versa,
Right.
or the customer that could impact the transmission, your siloed data and maybe your unorganized data exists. So like and I think, you and I talked before the podcast, you had a great analogy with the hardware stores, but really thinking about those IT systems that exist and the challenges of the integration. But like, I would love you to go through that analogy.
Yeah, this is one of my favorites. So I think the issue with, the lack of progress in this space is that people don't really understand these abstract concepts. Like I get the question a lot of the time, like what's the difference between a data engineer and a data scientist? What's going on?
Yeah.
Why do
Break
we
that
need
down.
people? So you should imagine your data like all the parts in a hardware store. Like imagine a Home Depot or Lowe's, and you walk in there, and the reason that you can go, let's say, get all the parts to build a house or a shed or pick a project is that you can walk up to a certain aisle, you know exactly what's on the shelf, you know the price of it, you know how many are there, you can get your stuff, move on, and go do what actually matters to your business or your project. Now, those parts are all your little bits of data. So imagine now the other scenario where you walk into Home Depot and they've taken everything off the shelves and it's in a big pile. Just a pile of trash, it looks like, right? There's 2x4s, there's screws, there's drills. Now, all the same parts are there, right? You know in your head and your heart, it's possible for me to build a house here. Well, but how much time should you set aside for your team to go get those parts? How many parts are even in there? What's the price of something when you pick it up off this huge pile, right? And that's the status of actually where, a lot of businesses, a lot of utilities, a lot of groups in mission critical sectors, right? They know their data is there, but it's in this big pile, making it effectively useless, right? And I think, that's a nice story, but the practical impact is insane cost drivers when you're trying to do data projects. And not only that, but you're going to be wasting a lot of your team's time. So yeah, sure, it is possible for you to get to some of these higher level optimization models, right? Like my team can work magic with data, but it's going to take a lot more time to get to that analysis. And you're only going to be able to do it like one time. Repeating it on the minute level, the hour level, the daily level, it's going to be very, very difficult, if not impossible.
Right. And so I think, did you break down like the data engineer versus the data scientist?
Sure. So I did not break that down, but you can imagine the data engineer is someone who's organizing all your data onto those shelves, right? So they're going from that pile of trash in the middle of the warehouse floor to nice shelves where it doesn't matter if you're the CTO, an accountant, an engineer in the field. When you walk into your data warehouse, you know exactly where to go. You know exactly what's there. You know exactly how much it's going to cost you to get that data off the shelves and into your project, whether that's, an analysis of how much overtime we're spending, the cost of maintenance for different poles in the field or other assets. You could imagine trying to tie in data from every sector of your business, right? Not just the forestry department, not just the accounting department or HR, but some of these high level analyses that we know are possible, right? That companies want to do. They're going to require data from every part of your business. And that's very powerful, but it requires a lot of change.
You said the word. So, and so I think from being within the utility space, if you're a system operator or your role is to ensure safe, reliable, affordable grid, it's running 24/7, 365. And so then you start hearing language around your data governance, your governance framework, who owns the data, what are the standards, what are the processes. That, depending on your headspace, could make you like blur out. And so a big part of the Grid Mod Pod is really focusing on the technology exists. The capabilities are like beyond our imagination. So we need to really focus on the change that is occurring from a cultural perspective of what it was. And quite frankly, I think at the origins of the grid, they were very creative, innovative, entrepreneurial thinkers that were in charge of creating the grid today. And over time, the grid operators and, doers are, their job is to create that safe, reliable, affordable system, which, kind of makes it hard now for many reasons to be that creative, innovative risk taker, because this is the lifeline of society. So when you hear the words like, who owns the data? I own the data. What are the processes? My processes are fine. Standards? Who needs standards? I got it, right? Like, it's a human response. And so, and then when we think about the IT teams and how they evolved within the utilities, they were really a service to, for human resources, for financial, for customer response. And the idea that the operation of the grid is highly intricate and tied to the other three groups is somewhat novel, because each of those groups kind of got the data they needed and ran with it. But now with the world we're in, I think, and you talked about this, and maybe you can elaborate on your experience, is the power of creating cross-functional teams, right? That you can't boil the ocean or swallow the elephant, right? But you can swallow a frog. Isn't that one of those advices about you eat the frog first? The worst thing. But anyway, so like what is that like kind of cross-team collaboration importance, and why IT ops and your analytics professional need to be there to like bridge the gap and drive this data revolution?
No, I love this question because it's practical, right? How do we actually get to some of this progress? So RedSynth, my group here, we're used to working in mission critical sectors, right? Things where you can't mess up. You get accidents. You could have insane damage to your plant or to the community. And so change management, data governance, they're insanely important, right? And we're used to navigating and getting to, that change. So how do you swallow the frog before the ocean? Well, one of the big reasons for our success, I believe, is that we start from really analyzing the cost and the value of, let's say, a certain project, right? So a lot of leaders think, hey, like these data insights I'm getting are free for my group to do, right? Well, if you start doing analyses or you're tracking all the different requests you're making through the organization, you're going to start to see a lot of time wasted, and you're going to see a lot of people being pulled in different directions. And actually, you can identify people that are holding it all together. These data champions or librarians or whatever you want to call it.
Stewards.
Sure. They're people that are, you make a request and you say, I want a dashboard showing me overtime hours and, compare historically. Well, they're going to ask this person and then these different people. And you end up with a lot of these ad hoc processes where people are going to different data sources, analyzing them. This person's touching them. They're connecting to this other person. And that is a very delicate chain, especially when people retire, people leave their job, accidents happen, there could be crises. Now, this is why we start from the cost and value, though, is you need to find an early win where you can understand, oh my goodness, we are wasting so much money here, we're leaving value on the table. Maybe you're finding people that are siphoning energy off the grid, right? There's lots of different values and costs you can consider. But that's when it starts to make a lot of sense to leadership, to the people who can make those higher level changes, that, oh my goodness, we not only should be investing in this area, but we need to invest in this because, yeah, sure, there are these little tiny problems we can solve now. But if you look at some of these bigger cost and value analyses, you're like, oh my goodness, if we had this and this and this. Well, now we can start getting to that 10%, 20%, 30% improvement that is unobtainable without some of these data-driven analyses.
So thinking for our listeners, so you have an individual contributor or a data steward or a change champion that knows that there's an incredibly inefficient process going on. And to gain the visibility of really the purse strings, the financial impacts, because everything, if you follow the dollar, it goes down to the affordability of the customer. And, ultimately the only things that customer respond to us as individuals is, and think about their local electric utility, is when they're moving, when a storm takes their lights out, and or if their bill looks a little awkward. So if you think about it, like from an individual whose job is burdened by having to walk into a Home Depot that didn't have the data engineer take its first effective whack, there's an enormous amount of efficiencies. But what allows the idea or the awareness of the problem to elevate is tying cost to the issue, which is quite a challenge in itself, especially if it's a multi-partied influenced process. And so I guess it's a very intricate space. So when people are like, how come, a utility is unable to rapidly embrace these technologies, I think it's really powerful for like you and I to have this conversation to really think about, there is a lot of learning and educating and empowering individuals, because this whole data analytics space is new, right? Like the availability of the data is what, in the last 10 or 15 years, it's only become more affordable from a storage and a transferring of the knowledge. And then now, the talent like yourself and the ability to see the data in the way that you need to see it and then break it down and then execute on it is also a new talent. So I guess my other, thing to think about is, so here's a utility wanting to take this transformational change, and quite honestly needs to happen before you can really achieve virtual power plants or, the ultimate ADMS. Like if you have solidified, clean data that can, you'll go a lot faster than maybe those that have gone before us. But it's like, what's your balance between developing really that in-house expertise and then relying on the external vendors or partners? Because that's a space the utilities are in. Like they don't have the talent, right, so they have to reach outside. But quite honestly, you need that expertise inside and have that strong partnership. So what are your thoughts on, exploring that and how to have the best type of partnership?
This is a great question, because it's really about how do we actually get to change, And in my opinion, there's a lot you can do internally to change the culture and the way we discuss data using tools that the utility sector already uses, right? So the first change is to start understanding that your data is infrastructure. Treat it the same, right? Treat it the same as you do your assets in the field. Treat it the same as, your investments, right? Because, and the reason I say that is your data really is a digital copy of your infrastructure, right? If you don't know how many poles are in your network, if you don't know the age of every transformer and the maintenance history and all this, well, your digital copy of your business is super flawed, right? And you wouldn't allow an accountant to go in the field, climb a pole, and change a transformer. You wouldn't allow an engineer to go into the HR system and start rooting around trying to change, who's up for overtime. And a lot of people understand that message. Oh my God, yeah, I would never let the VP of HR go out into the field and get in a bucket truck. So why would you let them change your data related to the age of transformers on your transmission line? So once you start understanding that, data needs to be almost as sacred as your real infrastructure in the field, well, then a lot of stuff starts, tumbling and avalanching down, right? You start seeing all the problems, right? Like, and it's not just, okay, in the moment, it's the whole history of your data, right? Because if that chain of record wasn't sacred, if that wasn't carefully maintained, well, how do you trust it? How do you know? Was there an intern in the system last summer that accidentally shifted all the poles by 10 meters? Was there, an accident on the IT side where they accidentally deleted all the maintenance history records or shifted, the unique identifier number by one? I don't know. Do you know that? If you don't, well, that's a huge red flag. And, my firm can help you address that, but it starts from that internal change, right? It comes from the top. And once you start incentivizing your teams to treat data this way, well, it doesn't matter if you have an internal data science team or an external one, you're going to be able to ask the right questions. You're going to be able to make sure the right protocols are in place because utilities know how to work with infrastructure, right? They've been keeping the lights on for decades, right? Let's say 100 years. Let's say
140.
140, right?
Right. That's what I say.
Yeah. I see they established 1885 back there. Anyways, I think it's daunting, right? And it's a huge job ahead.
And I think, the first step in solving any problem is identifying the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, so there's like this hierarchical conversation of change and how to, I think the key to it and really one of my objectives of, the Grid Mod Pod is to really highlight the individual contributors and or utilities that are empowering those that understand the operation of the grid and are actively pursuing really what we're talking about. So, and that it has a trickle up effect, right, versus a trickle down. So if we can empower the individuals to be data stewards and then also develop and create a very strong team that understands the operational assets. So coming from the operations perspective and then give them, and it doesn't have to be a large group. I think from your, you sharing in the past, it's just like, the power of having savvy programmers with access to existing data sets can exponentially change your position if given the right vision. And I think another visual in one of your slide decks from our conversations was your pyramid of 80-20. I don't want to steal your thunder. So like, what have you seen in, from your experience in that world?
Oh yeah. So the 80-20 rule, and this is something I heard.
I mentioned it on this pod, so you can go ahead. And,
this is something that came up in all of my, machine learning AI courses at Carnegie Mellon. Like it's a rule that's held true for decades. And that's, if you're trying to do a data analytics project, 80% of the work is going to be the data accumulation and cleaning and aggregation. 20% is all that fancy technology that everyone loves to talk about on podcasts and this and that. I don't like to use those buzzwords, right? My team they're all experts in these tools. They don't just use them. They write the code. They build the models. At the end of the day, it's all pattern finding, right? That 20% is just finding patterns that you can use to make better decisions. But that 80%, right? That's going to be overlooked, right? It's not exciting. You're not going to see a blog post about that. You're not going to see someone on LinkedIn talking about how great it is. Well, without that 80% of the work, you're not going to have AI tools. You're not going to have machine learning. You're not going to have that pattern finding. Now, that's all great. You can believe me or not, but imagine doing 80% of that work for one round of analysis and having to start fresh every time. That's horrible, right?
That's an energy killer.
Right. It is a treadmill. And like the back to the Home Depot metaphor, right? Imagine you clean up the shelves, right? And then you build your house and you just start over, right? And it doesn't make any sense in the physical model because why would you do that? Why would you collapse all the shelves on the ground? Why would you start fresh? That's what happens with a lot of data analysis pipelines, right? And especially when there's humans in the loop for doing the data aggregations, right? If Sandy from Human Resources has to go talk to Bill from engineering and Carla from engineering to like get these little reports together. If your accounting team has to go ask every project manager in your group what the status of the project is, well, that 80% of the work is actually more like 100% of the work because you're doing the same treadmill every.
Or you spend like 40 hours creating a slide deck with a significant amount of metrics with your, assumptions stated. And then like halfway through your presentation to the leadership, they say, well, what about that assumption? Could you tweak it a little bit to the right, a little bit to the left? And that really will require the due diligence of another 40 hours of work to get one number. So like that and it happens in really all industries, but like, I think we don't talk about it enough. And especially when trying to implement, a strategic data officer or like a data governance framework team, like if you're not feeling the pains of what you just discussed, it's really hard to get the message across. But, we're putting words to that burden.
Yeah. And something we harp on a lot is track the cost, track that 80%. Don't just wait on your teams to do it, right? You need to understand who's talking to who's emailing who, why are these steps taking so long? Record it like you're an accountant, and don't just say, oh, well, it's a lot of work. Oh, you got to look at the data tables. Don't do that. Start from the metrics, start from who's talking to who, and record all the work that was required to set up that 80%. And once you start doing that, it becomes very obvious. Oh, why aren't we automating this? Why isn't this a pipeline? Once you see those problems, you can be very effective when you're either building an internal data science team or hiring support, right? Because you can identify the problem and say, look, we need to, I don't know, get all the Home Depot shelves in order first.
I think the visual and just the realization of every day, if you walked into Home Depot, like if you're a general contractor, every day you're there rebuilding a kitchen or like putting on an addition, and you had to literally like scavenge through this pile of materials. I mean, you wouldn't show up probably after a day. Right. So when we think about like talent acquisition and cultural to maintain talent, and then, creating the energy within various organizations, like giving them that clarity is so important. So I guess, like a common roadblock for really any industry that wants to embark upon capitalizing, I use that word, I don't use it lightly, but the data, which quite honestly, there's a significant amount of data that already has a cost laying in that pile. So like, really, how do they, internalize these capabilities and then really drive? It comes from resistance to change, especially shifting from legacy systems. So there are systems in place that are doing the job today. Are they the best? Right, wrong, or indifferent? Probably not. To driving to this data-driven process is a significant, and I think it's probably the number one roadblock of why we don't see the transformation, because how utilities are operated and the amount of risk and or siloed essence that they are because of how it was created, is the struggle.
Let me share a story about, this is a great example from another, we were working with possibly the largest producer of PVC in America, PVC pipes, siding, it's a huge industry. Now, we were building a tool to help them manage where their rail cars are in their system. And this was causing a lot of distress. And, let me start by saying the team was doing an excellent job at managing their assets, right? Given the tools they were using. But there was a lot of pushback to push for change, right? A lot of people say, I've been doing this for 20 years. Like, an algorithm can't help me. I don't need this. Like, this is just the cost of the job. These are just the inefficiencies of the nature of the work. Well, we were able to identify there was some pain points. For instance, didn't have GPS location of their assets. And once we built up this tool, well, we actually prevented $40 million of, I don't call them mistakes, but like work stoppages.
And I guess you just said it, you just kind of mic drop. And I think we should leave, $40 million, I think identifying that, right? That, that can show up all different ways in your financial sheets. But like, I think there's an insurmountable amount of positive use cases like that really we all know about, but making that, getting in, identifying the data sources, identifying the process, and then showing the real value takes time, right? And, I think the biggest hurdle is just believing in that reality to then take that leap. And what type of levers, and I think this is just us now being philosophers, like, and maybe just planting seeds in those that have the power to make decisions to really make this their priority when setting up and preparing to modernize the grid. It's foundational. Like, I think like in the DOE, they made this for all of you out there, that 4 volumes, the grid modernization roadmap, and it breaks down the very complex, intricate plan, but at the base of it is your physical assets. And then the next is your IT systems and how you communicate to all these assets. And then like the third is kind of like your various tools through like advanced distribution management system. but really advanced transmission management system. But all I have to say is like, I think a component, and it's in there, it gets into like, to do really well at the physical assets and your IT systems, that's the 80%. That's the heavy lift. But we're so focused, and when we say we as a society, external stakeholders, regulators, insisting, and you said it earlier, and that's where all that, the articles and the LinkedIn posts is on that 20% North Star, and no one wants to talk about that base 80%.
Right.
Yeah, I love it. But it really comes down to having the right language, right? Having the empowered people that understand the functions of these data sets, the systems, and how to pull it, cleanse it, pipe it, and then make it available to all of the groups to then take action on it.
So I think some of what's made us successful is starting from the notion that these teams are doing a really good job, using these outdated tools. We've seen teams using paper databases, right, in the year 2024, using paper to manage enough distribution miles to reach the moon, which is an insane logistical effort, right? And these teams are doing a really great job. They also have all the knowledge, right? So these tools need to support your teams, right? That's a great way to get buy-in, saying, look, you're the human in the loop. We're building you like a robot assistant or eyes in the sky or a dashboard that's going to make your life way easier every day when you have to figure out where all your crews are at. And once you start empowering the people doing the work, you can start to get buy-in for that vision of like one source of truth that everyone's contributing to, and then everyone can read from the same location, right? Like if you have this sacred model, I keep saying the word sacred, but it really is important to treat these things like they can't be sullied or dirtied. And, you need to have experts contributing to the data set, and that's the data governance. Who can contribute what and when, and do they need sign-offs? Do they need secret passwords or whatever? But then once you have this nice model of your business that is, hey, this is our business. You can get a loan on that data. You can go hire another firm. This is our business. This is it, right? You don't need to talk to other people. These are all the facts. Well, then teams can read from it, right? They can start going to that source of truth. When someone asks, hey, where's the data? Well, you know where it is. It's in the only place it could be. And I've seen the power when teams and people doing the work start feeling like they're contributing to something bigger. They don't like to redo the work. If you walk the same miles every year and you record the same problems and they just evaporate, that's pretty disheartening. There's a lot of people who really believe in the mission of keeping the lights on, and they're out there recording, they're out there observing, they're seeing the same problems time and time again. Now, if you can start developing a pipeline where those observations are actually recorded and seen as valuable, that's insanely empowering. I've seen the smiles, I've seen the pride. People can say, look, I contributed that. That data is why we're not having crews driving around for no reason. That data is why we're not running out of bucket trucks anymore, or why we're identifying dangerous equipment, and everyone can know that, hey, like this is maybe a riskier job because of a bad owner on the property, right? Or an aggressive dog even, right? Like these kind of insights, right? People like contributing to this data set because they feel like, hey, I'm actually helping other people in my organization, or I'm helping future me, right?
Yeah. Well, I think, key takeaways is, and I think this conversation and why I was excited to have it with you is, the fundamentals are now becoming more discussed, which is, there is a significant amount of data governance, innovation groups, emerging technology groups that are popping up in utilities. And I think the next step is really like creating the language and empowering not only the leaders, because I actually think everyone's a leader, right? But those that could have the ability to, say yes to the needs of the individuals is, empowering creative thought. And I think you and I talked about this prior of, if you think about the stodgy engineering world and kind of the perception of, an engineer, I think, quite frankly, we lost a lot of like a true engineer is very creative and can think outside the box. But because of like the schooling and the mechanics and really kind of the diligence that we've got ourselves into and just like going by the same ways of before, I'm not sure. And I guess this is just being a mother of six and seeing the schooling and how the education works is like, it's really limited of like developing that spirit. And so I always kind of end the podcast on asking, those that are in the industry right now, which I know you're kind of like helping the industry within the industry, but like, what is, food for thought or an area for those that want to take part in helping to keep the lights on, being a part of really society's lifeline that we've now have developed? What's something to think about or, focus on, if they want to get involved and help, keep this transformation smooth?
Yeah, no, I love it because the reason I continue to work in the utility space is because I think it's the most important thing in our society. It's the price of electricity. The price of the access and the price to energy literally drives human progress. And that's the bottom line. I can almost prove it mathematically. So I think that's more important than any sort of hierarchy in your organization. That's more important than your well-defined role. And these are the things that stop people from being creative, right? When they feel like the process is so rigid, there's nothing that can be done to change. So my words of encouragement are to understand that your creativity is actually the number one thing that some people look for. When I'm hiring an engineer, that's the number one thing I'm thinking about. The technical excellence should be a given. If you're an engineer, you've been through the program, you understand, Liz, how hard it is to get those accreditations, how hard it is to be going through those textbooks, those all-nighters. So I assume and I expect technical excellence from my engineers. But that creativity is what separates someone getting hired or not in my firm. And a lot of people, I get pushback on this all the time. They say, oh, creative engineer, are you an idiot? I don't want a creative engineer to build my airplanes. Well, that's shocking to me because I want those creative engineers. How are you going to catch the problems if you're not creative? A great example is the San Francisco Bay Bridge. It was almost an engineering disaster. So they built this huge bridge, billions of dollars, and no material scientists checked the compatibility of the rivets and the bolts with the materials they used for the beams. And so you got this contact rusting where just certain metals, right? And these you can look them up in tables, right? Certain metals, when they touch, they will rust. To end of the story. And they're going to start corroding. So I think it was $2 or $3 billion of repairs spent to replace every single bolt on that Bay Bridge. And why did that happen? Well, there was rigorous processes in the design, but creativity was not encouraged to, dig into the problems, right? Think what could be going wrong here? And not just in normal operations, the Tacoma Narrow Bridge is another example where the wind on one day actually built a resonance wave and the bridge collapsed. It was a huge engineering disaster. No one thought about it. What happens if the wind causes a resonance frequency? So anyways, if anyone's listening to this and they're feeling stuck in their job, they're stuck in their role, lean into that creativity because
or in school, trying to decide what they want to do with life.
Yeah, if you're in school, your engineering accreditations, your technical skills, those are just tools. I actually hung my PhD in my workshop in my basement, in my kind of garage area. And people see it and they laugh. They think, well, why is this down here? It's another tool that I use to solve problems. And, I encourage any creative thinker, anyone out there who's trying to solve problems to make a proof of concept, right? Do a demo. That's what gets people's attention is someone who's gone and done it, And I love encouraging people to do that. I love supporting people who are trying to change things. And I love working with clients who see the value in that. And I believe that's why our business has been so successful. So that's what makes us different, right? Is the creativity, challenging assumptions, digging into things that people say, oh yeah, it's nothing over there. Are you sure about that?
I will end it on this little story because I know we're running over. But, when we think about universities and colleges and the origination of them, like when we go over to, let's just say across the pond, big purpose of it was to bring like-minded folk into a room, aka a classroom, and the professor was the moderator of the conversation.
Sure.
So like the beginnings of university or college was to get thinkers to ask questions, debate, develop, create, standardize, repeat. And then it really evolved into this space that, it's probably a whole other podcast. But we have to think, the reality is having that type of creative thought needs to be empowered and embraced, especially when we're going through this grid modernization transformation.
Oh,
I think that's
absolutely.
a great way to sum up. And, how do we create that culture within the utilities to really embrace, what's available to them now? So,
yeah. And I guess my 2 cents there is there are groups that are out there doing it and they will steamroll people that aren't. So this isn't something you can afford not to embrace, right?
So what you're saying is they're not leprechauns, they exist, and just lean in and ask the right questions to find those folk, and you will not be unhappy. So this is great. Well, thank you, Connor. I love the conversation. I look forward to sharing this transformational journey in the space with you. And with that, till next time, listeners.
Great talking with you, Liz. Thanks for listening, everybody.
That's a wrap for this week's episode of the Grid Mod Pod. Thanks for tuning in. We hope today's conversation got you thinking about new and creative ways to improve our power grid. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to be the first to hear new episodes. This podcast is brought to you by AEIC, the place where operations leaders come together to share knowledge and provide guidance to the electric utility industry. We'll be back with a new episode soon. Until then, keep powering on.